episode, we will be throwing light on Chalcolithic cultures of the Deccan, South India and Eastern India. To help me in this regard, I have with me Dr. Nupur Dasgupta, Professor of History, Jadavpur University, and Ms. Preeta Bhattacharya of the Department of Ancient History and Culture, University of Calcutta.
The archaeologists suggest that Malwa culture was seeping gradually into parts of Deccan, and the main concentration of the sites were in the river valleys of Pravara, Godavari, Bhima, Tapi, etc. And there were subtle differences in pottery types, because here we have a finer fabric which were baked at a very high temperature, and also we have different shapes which we didn't have in central India, like the spouted vessels and the deep bowls. These are rare shapes that we do not get in central India.
Preeta, can you tell us about the very interesting site of Daimabad?
Yes, Daimabad is very interesting because we have continuous occupation from a very early level, and most of the layers are associated with copper. Take for example period 2 of Daimabad, which is associated with late Harappan occupation, and here you have a distinctive pottery, black on red ware, and you have the advent of copper. The third phase at Daimabad is represented by the Daimabad culture, and here also we have evidence that copper was locally smelted, and we have a flourishing blade tool industry, bead industry, bone tools, etc. The third phase is the Malwa culture phase, where we have extensive structural remains. We have rectangular spacious houses with plastered floor, mud walls, hearths and wooden posts to support the roof, and we also have beads, different kinds of beads, bone tools, microlithic industry, etc.
Can you tell us something about the burial pattern and the crop pattern?
Actually, we have pit and urn burials here. About 16 have been recovered, and about the crop pattern, the staple crop is barley. But we also have three varieties of wheat, and we also have pulses, lentils, etc.
So Preeta, can you tell us something about the site of Inamgaon?
Inamgaon actually is a very well documented site. It's on the Ghor Valley, and the period 1 itself is associated with Malwa culture, and there we have extensive structural remains. Mostly what we have are the wattle and daub houses with plastered floors and thatched roofs, conical roofs, and we also have hearths inside the houses.
Tell us something about the food habits of the inhabitants.
Yes, the staple crop of this region is actually barley. Wheat couldn't prosper because of scarcity of rains, and we also have discovered some storage chambers dug underground, and we also have wickerwork baskets which were used to store grain or food or something. About the other aspects of material culture, we can say that copper technology was very well developed, and the stone tool industry was also quite flourishing. We have the bead industry fashioned from carnelian and jasper, which were available locally. But we also know that people of Inamgaon actually travelled as far as up to the seaside, which is 200 kilometers away, to get seashells. And among other cultural items, we have terracotta figurines, mostly of mother goddesses and bulls, and so on.
Jorwe culture is a very unique context in which we find mostly in Deccan. It actually emerged in the Godavari Pravara basin, but it also extended to the Tapi basin in the north and to the Krishna Valley in the south. The most important area is of course the Godavari Pravara area. We have three very important and very large sites of this culture here, and they are Inamgaon, Daimabad and Prakash. And these sites are actually signifying permanent village settlements of a very substantial economy. They are, all three of them are larger than 20 hectares in size, and they are permanent settlements. Can you tell us something about Walki? Because there are certain other sites, a number of pastoral seasonal campsites also. So what kind of a site was Walki, which is very recently discovered?
Actually, Walki is in the Bhima Valley, and archaeologists are of the opinion that Walki had constant cultural contact with major sites like Inamgaon, which is about 27 kilometers away. Anyway, all the Jorwe culture sites were abandoned by 1000 BCE.
Tell us something about the Jorwe culture at Daimabad.
Daimabad, we have already seen that there was a Malwa culture phase followed by this Jorwe culture. The structural remains show somewhat of a continuity, although very interestingly the size increases in this phase, and from 20 hectares the size of Daimabad gets almost to 30 hectares in size. And not only that, we see that there are some structural complexes which have been identified by the kind of use that they were put to. So we have been able to identify a particular complex as the butcher's house, another as a potter's house, and a third as a bead maker's house. Not only does it throw light on craft specialization in this region, but it also throws light on different kinds of habitation units. It also probably throws light on the social structure of this very complex village, which was developing into a very complex society and a very substantial economic unit. And the other structural remains is a mud rampart, which is also interesting. It is founded on stone foundation, and there is another very interesting structure which is apsidal in shape, and it has been identified as a temple because at the center of it we find there is a pit containing ash. So this is also very interesting. Apart from that, as we all know, the characteristic pottery is the black painted red ware, which is a Jorwe pottery, and the paintings are very beautiful. And apart from that, we have another interesting addition to this culture in the nature of food. That is, there is this introduction of a new crop of millet. Yes, so millet is introduced, and in general the animal domestication pattern is almost similar, and other aspects of the culture is also similar, but there is a kind of a flourishing nature of economy that is found.
Rita, can you tell us something about the Jorwe culture in Inamgaon?
Jorwe culture in Inamgaon has an early time bracket from about 1400 BCE to about 1000 BCE. We have extensive structural remains from the site. The houses are more or less similar with the earlier Malwa phase, but they are more spacious and they're laid out in rows, and in between we have spaces. In the houses we have fire pits. It's a very striking feature. The fire pits were protected, sheltered from the wind with clay walls, high clay walls, and probably at the bottom they had a large stone slab covered with mud which supported the cooking pot. There's a multi-roomed complex which had about 5 rooms, and we also have a very curious burial pattern. We have an extraordinary burial of an adult male who was placed in a jar, an anthropomorphic jar, in a crouching position, which, as we all know, signified the womb in primitive societies.
So about the burial pattern in Daimabad of the Jorwe phase, we find that mostly it is a urn burial, but there are some burials which are extended pit burials too. So it seems that the Jorwe phase burial pattern from Daimabad and Inamgaon do have some distinctions between them. So although the cultures belong to the same complex, probably internally they had certain differences between them. Prita, can we have some details about the domestic structures at Inamgaon?
The domestic structures at Inamgaon are actually very carefully thought out. Each feature, each element of the structures are carefully thought out. Like, the pit silos that were dug in the ground of the houses to store grain. And the floors of the houses were made of rammed clay with alternate layers of silt and fine sand. And then we have an element of planning in this entire site. Here we have even nicely made courtyard where they were stockading animals, because the nitrogen content of the soil is quite high. From that we can deduce that these were used for stockading animals. So from here we have a clear picture of the mundane everyday life of the people of Inamgaon.
I have already discussed about the separate dwelling houses of the craft specialists.
Yes.
So, and that also in a very formulated space use. So, it seems that they had really evolved to that phase of cultural activity where they could do a planned habitation organization.
I can tell you something about the food economy of the region. This appears to have been a very prosperous phase with regards to farming and cattle breeding. And irrigation appears to be an important public work. And we have also winter crops like barley, peas and lentil. But sometime in period 3 there was a change in the subsistence pattern.
Okay.
Because we find that more hardier crops like horse gram came to be produced. And the subsistence pattern also changed. We find a greater reliance on hunting and collecting wild plants. So they appear very strange phenomenon regarding this region.
Buddhi, can you tell us something about the craft items?
It is very interesting to note. I don't know whether it matches with what Rita has told us, but copper is scarcer than the other sites or than the other phase. But there is copper, of course, and it seems that copper was brought in probably from Rajasthan. All the local copper was available. We have some copper slag also, which goes to show that there was some kind of smelting and manufacturing activity going on at the site. And we have already identified one dwelling as a coppersmith's house. So that is there. Apart from that, the most interesting thing is that we have got probably use of gold, manufacturing of gold at the site. So we get some gold as artifacts. And then we have a number of semi-precious stone beads, and we also have pottery kilns. We have the potter's house, and it seems that they were also manufacturing terracotta figurines. So that is actually a continuity from the earlier phase of Malwa culture, which we have discussed. But the interesting point is that they were resourcing different kinds of raw materials from different places. As you had already mentioned that the people from Inamgao went to the seashore to collect shell. Yes, we have that evidence for the Jorwe phase at Inamgao also, that they were collecting shell from probably the Gujarat shores, and they were collecting, interestingly enough, they were collecting gold and ivory probably from Karnataka. Okay, so it seems that they were going beyond their own local boundaries to collect raw material. So in spite of the fact that maybe around 1000 BC the culture was getting dissipated, but before that we do have a growing energy filled cultural activity in this complex.
M.K. Dhavalikar has a very interesting argument that there was a stratified society in particularly in Inamgao, and he has argued that it was some kind of a chiefdom level organization. I think he was talking about the hierarchy of the settlements, the major settlements like Inamgao and the satellite settlements, but he hasn't really fleshed out the relationships between these sites. And he was also talking about the irrigation projects, storage systems, and about the high status burial that was unearthed in Inamgao to substantiate his argument.
It seems that therefore that not only was there a hierarchy among the different sites, but there was a hierarchy among the society living within these sites. And this is quite evident. For example, you see at Daimabad and Inamgao, the structures, remains of the structures do show that there were certain bigger complexes for habitation of prominent personages. Another thing which I find very interesting is that it is also propounded by M.K. Dhavalikar in the context of India, but it was first actually talked about by Vita Finzi in the context of the world, that there is the people of any prehistoric culture tend to go out and there is a peripheral activity within a given orbit. So it seems that Dhavalikar used that idea to understand the activities at Inamgao, and they took, probably the people at Inamgao went to up to 10 kilometers or even outside that. As you said, it's about 27 kilometers. So yes, so it seems that they had gone beyond that distance to collect their raw material, or to also to contact other people from other cultures. This is also evident from Daimabad. We see that there is a Harappan, a semi-Harappan layer from Daimabad, which precedes the Malwa phase. So probably there was coming in of the, or some kind of contact with the Harappans. So these things developed as a result of certain cultural contacts as well as from the growth of economy from
South Indian Chalcolithic assemblage have been found from various regions, namely Sanganakallu, Maski, Brahmagiri, Piklihal, and also other regions as well. Settlements have been found on granite hilltops and also on terraced hillsides and plateaus. The assemblage mainly consists of cells and stone blades as well as bronze and copper artifacts. In the subsequent period, we also find copper made chisels and arrowheads, and so we find that a lot of copper is being used in these regions. Then for cultivation, we find some hardier kinds of crops like horse gram and barley. Then domesticated animals is well in evidence because the bones have cut marks. And regarding cultivation, it can also be noticed that they had mostly have been done on terraced hillsides. Most of them fall between 2100 to 1500 BCE. During the period from stretching from 1500 to 1050 BCE, we find a new kind of buff and grey ware and another kind of wheel made unburnished ware with purple designs.
Okay.
So more or less this is the material assemblage of the regions, and it is also noticeable that besides stone, copper is being increasingly made to use.
There is a rich and diverse Chalcolithic complex available from the eastern part of India, especially from eastern UP, Bihar, Orissa and Bengal, West Bengal. From eastern UP we have two very important sites of Khairadi and Narhan. Narhan is a very distinguished culture which has its own pottery, but coming to Bihar we have a very interesting picture. Here we find that there were already these Neolithic sites which we have talked about in an earlier unit, the sites like Senuar, Taradi and Chirand, and at all these sites we find that a later phase there is the efflorescence of Chalcolithic culture. So it seems that there was a development at the older sites, but there is also at the same time evolution of new sites which begin their life with the Chalcolithic only, and such evidence is available from Champa and Oriup and other such places. So this is very interesting. This evidence is available from the Middle Ganga basin, which is going to witness the efflorescence of further cultural evolution.
Orissa is a bit problematic, because we haven't been able to distinguish a clear Chalcolithic layer in Orissa, and
Yes.
we always tend to draw a straight line between red and black ware and Chalcolithic phase, which is problematic again. So we have the site of Golbai Sasan on the bank of Mandakini, where we have the red and black ware as well as the dull red ware, the burnished red ware, the black ware and the chocolate ware. We also have an array of copper items from this site, as well as a very flourishing stone tool industry. Moving on to Bengal, can you tell us something about the sites in Bengal?
You see, most of the Chalcolithic sites emerged in Bengal in the valleys of Ajay, Kunur and Khargeshwari and Damodar. We find these sites have been discovered since the days of Parishchandra Dasgupta, who took extensive explorations in this region. The most prominent sites are, for example, Pakhanna, Bahiri, Baneshwar Danga, Bharatpur, Mongol Court and Mahistal, and then Panduraja Thipi is one of the most important sites excavated by Parishchandra Dasgupta, and then we have down south in Tamluk and Tulsipur in the Midnapur region. Rita, can you tell us something more in details about these cultures from Bengal?
In Bengal we find a marked Chalcolithic phase, but about its antecedents we are not very sure. As you have already mentioned, Panduraja Dhibi on the Ajay Valley is the most important site. Here in period 2 we have a distinctive white painted pottery which has black and red designs on them, and in association with them we have a plain buff colored pottery and black and red ware kind of pottery, a little bit different from the other regions. Among the other artifacts of this assemblage we find bone tools, then a little limited amount of copper implements, then beads and terracotta objects. Now amongst the other sites of this region you have already mentioned Bharatpur in the Damodar Valley, Mahisadal on the Kopai Valley region. And what I can tell you about the structural remains is that over here we have found several rammed floors in deposits 2 meter high. Animals were domesticated because animal bones have been found, and most interestingly in the core of the potteries we have found rice husk.
Yes.
Can you tell us something about Mongol Court, which is a very famous site now?
Yes. Mongol Court and Panduraja Thipi are the most important sites from this region. At Mongol Court, we find that there was some use of copper, and copper slag and fragments have been found. Some amount of lithic assemblage, as well as beads of semi-precious stones and shell objects and other such objects have been found, and terracotta figurines have also been found. About pottery, we have a distinctive black and red ware with the designs made with white and black pigments. So this is generally from Mongol Court. There is evidence for quite a nice structural evidence from Mongol Court. But the most important point is that at many sites like Mongol Court, Pandurajar Thibi, Hatikra from Bengal, and Golbai Sasan from Orissa, we find that there is an overlap phase in the Chalcolithic. We find that suddenly there is the coming of iron objects. So we call this a Ferro-Chalcolithic phase. So this is something unique about Bengal, and similar kind of thing we have also seen in Chalcolithic South India, where we find that all of a sudden the iron comes and it's a megalithic phase already. So this is what is interesting about the Bengal culture, that for the origin is also not very clear. We have Chalcolithic like that only, and also the end of Chalcolithic is not very clear because it has an overlap phase of Iron Age. In general, do we then see that there was an evolution of Chalcolithic culture, quite substantial Chalcolithic culture outside the Harappan orbit? What is your opinion, Rita?
From what we have discussed in the two units that we have discussed together, it is obvious that outside the Harappan orbit there developed distinctive local Chalcolithic cultures where they have used metal in spite of lithic tools being in prevalence during that time. So copper was being increasingly used, and what we have discussed so far regarding Bengal and the calibrated date being 12th century BCE, iron has also come into use. So an increasing use of metal besides lithic tools is increasingly coming into prominence.
The foundations for what was to happen in the Iron Age, that was taking place in the Chalcolithic phase. It is true that if you compare what was happening in the copper bronze civilization of the Harappan context, the other contexts fall far short of it in terms of accumulation of wealth, or in terms of organization and distribution, all that. But apart from that, if we look at the agricultural pattern, we find that each region was finding out its own strength, points of strength. Each region was cultivating its choicest crops which could grow only in that particular ecosystem, and they were also obtaining raw material as far as possible from the nearby sources. They traveled beyond their own area to procure raw materials, and they were also going on towards craft specialization, and there was separate units formed within a settlement for separate kinds of jobs, and they had their own cultural repertoire, although in a much less dazzling way than the Harappan culture. The Chalcolithic culture in other parts of the Indian subcontinent outside the Harappan orbit was developing towards further growth.